Washington, D.C. is one of the richest metro areas in the world, but it doesn't have a true skyscraper skyline. Most buildings are capped at roughly the height of a 12-story apartment. The skyline belongs to domes and monuments, like the Capitol and the Washington Monument. Stand anywhere in the city and look around, and what you see are symbols of democratic government towering over a horizontal landscape of mid-rise buildings that never compete with these monuments for attention. Chicago scores 0.9 on a scale where one represents a perfect grid, making it one of the most orderly city layouts ever measured. Washington, D.C. has a completely different approach. Where Chicago optimized for efficiency, Washington prioritized grand symbolism and ceremony, and yet despite that choice, walkable space in D.C. commands major rent premiums over car-dependent suburbs. Also, a street layout drawn in 1791 still governs how millions of people move through the city today. So how does a city designed for symbolism function well enough to feel like America's second best designed city? And why has this ceremonial layout survived 200 years without being simplified? In 1791, President George Washington hired Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a French-born engineer, to design the nation's capital. L'Enfant had grown up at Versailles, where his father worked as a painter for Louis XV. He understood how European monarchs built their cities, designed to glorify the king and display his power. L'Enfant proposed taking those exact techniques and inverting them. Instead of celebrating a monarch, he would use the same planning principles to celebrate the sovereignty of the people. He placed the Congress House on Jenkins Hill, the highest point in the area, which he described as a pedestal awaiting a monument. From there, he laid out two systems layered on top of each other. The first was a standard grid of numbered and lettered streets running north-south and east-west, providing the basic structure. The second was a network of wide diagonal avenues, each 160 feet across, shooting outward like spokes on a wheel. L'Enfant named each diagonal after the states of Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Virginia. The street map itself became a symbolic representation of the Federal Union. Pennsylvania Avenue was designed to create a direct visual connection between the Capitol and the White House, making the distance between the legislative and executive powers walkable. The diagonal avenues converged at massive traffic circles that would function as public plazas, each one anchoring a different neighborhood. Places like DuPont Circle, Logan Circle, and Washington Circle trace back to that original system meant to create what L'Enfant called reciprocity of sight between important buildings. Where Versailles had roads leading to a palace, Washington would have sightlines leading to institutions of representative democracy. The street layout itself was meant to communicate ideas about how governments should work. L'Enfant embedded deeper mathematical patterns into the design. Using the Capitol as the center, he mapped the city in rings, with roads and avenues laid out at carefully chosen distances. Around the Capitol, the streets form star-like patterns, meant to symbolize the people and the land. Around the White House, the shapes become more rigid and formal, reinforcing power and authority. Whether you buy into the symbolism or not, L'Enfant spent enormous effort building these patterns into the capital city, and they still affect movement through Washington today. Congress approved the plan, construction began, and almost immediately the problem started. The diagonal avenues created oddly shaped blocks that were nearly impossible to develop efficiently. The enormous width of the avenues meant huge amounts of expensive urban land sat empty as pavement. The city grew slowly because the street layout actively fought against the kind of efficient land speculation that fueled growth in cities like New York and Philadelphia. By the mid-1800s, there was serious discussion about abandoning L'Enfant's design entirely. The diagonal avenues seemed like an expensive European fantasy that didn't work in practical America. What nobody understood was that the design wasn't meant to be practical, and what would make it permanent hadn't been built yet. In 1894, a developer named Thomas Franklin Schneider completed the Cairo Hotel on Q Street Northwest. It was 12 stories tall, 164 feet high, and it set off alarms in Congress because of what it represented. If one developer could build 12 stories, others would follow. Within a generation, tall buildings would spread across the city, and eventually they would block the views L'Enfant had designed. The visual system that had made Washington different from every other American city would disappear. In 1899, Congress passed the Height of Buildings Act. The law was refined in 1910 with restrictions that remain in effect today. It limited buildings to the width of the adjacent street plus 20 feet, with an absolute cap of 130 feet on commercial streets and 90 feet on residential ones. The law preserved L'Enfant's sightlines and made his entire design system work. Chicago, faced with expensive downtown land, built upwards. The city pioneered the Chicago skeleton, the steel frame construction that allowed corporate towers to define the skyline. Washington, unable to build up, built out. Jobs, housing, and retail spread horizontally across many blocks, instead of concentrated in a few tall buildings. This created what urban planners call horizontal density. Walk through downtown Washington today, and the visual hierarchy is immediately clear. The Capitol Dome rises above everything. The Lincoln Memorial commands the western end of the National Mall without any competing structures. Office buildings and apartment blocks fill the spaces between monuments, but they never challenge the symbolic importance of public architecture. The height restrictions preserved exactly what L'Enfant intended, but they also produced an unexpected benefit. Washington doesn't have the canyon effect common in cities like New York or Chicago, where tall buildings create shadowed corridors at street level. The low skyline keeps sidewalks and public spaces open to the sun throughout the day. The same horizontal spread that preserved L'Enfant's vision also made the city more valuable. Walkable urban areas in DC command rent premiums far above comparable space in drivable suburban locations. The height restrictions that were designed to protect symbolic views accidentally created the most economically successful urban form in the region. But that raises another question. If the design was so brilliant, why did it nearly disappear? By 1900, the National Mall had become a disaster. Railroad tracks cut across the open grass, carrying freight directly to the Capitol building. Victorian gardens and informal landscaping blocked the clean sightlines L'Enfant had designed. The symbolic heart of the city, the grand ceremonial space that was supposed to justify the entire complicated street layout, looked like an industrial rail yard. The grand diagonal avenues still existed, threading through the city at their impossible angles. But the mall itself, which was meant to anchor the entire composition and demonstrate why all those diagonal streets made sense, had degraded into something incoherent. Without the mall functioning as L'Enfant intended, the rest of the city's elaborate street system seemed arbitrary and impractical. In 1901, the Senate formed the Macmillan Commission to fix it. One of the names on the commission was Daniel Burnham, a major force in Chicago's early development. They sent the team to Europe to study Versailles and other sites that had influenced L'Enfant's original thinking. When they returned, they proposed something radical: remove everything that didn't match the original vision and restore the mall to what L'Enfant had intended. The Macmillan plan set the mall's cross-shaped spine: the Capitol to the east, the Lincoln Memorial to the west, the White House to the north, and the Jefferson Memorial to the south, with the Washington Monument dead center. They ripped out the rail lines, cleared the Victorian clutter, and reopened the mall into one clean stretch of grass and straight sightlines. It took decades to complete. The Lincoln Memorial wasn't finished until 1922. The Jefferson Memorial came even later in 1943. But the framework held. Once the mall was restored to L'Enfant's vision, the diagonal avenues that had seemed impractical suddenly had clear purpose. The width of the avenues stopped feeling wasteful once you could stand on Pennsylvania Avenue and see directly from the Capitol to the White House. The restoration demonstrated that L'Enfant's design could be recovered even after decades of contradictory development. More importantly, it created institutional momentum that has protected the plan ever since. When developers propose modifying the height restrictions or creating exceptions for economic development, the answer is almost always no. The Macmillan Plan set a precedent that the symbolic and ceremonial functions of the city take priority over market forces. But the important factor here isn't the skyline, it's the price tag. So how does a city that can't build upward still end up charging a premium for walkable life? The pattern extends beyond the original city boundaries. Nearly half of Washington's walkable urban space is located in surrounding areas like Arlington, Bethesda, and Alexandria, which developed their own dense mid-rise centers in response to the constraints downtown. These suburbs urbanized in ways that rarely happen in other American metro areas, creating what researchers call urbanizing suburbs. They have their own street-level retail, their own employment centers, their own transit connections. The entire region functions as an interconnected network of walkable districts rather than a traditional hub-and-spoke system with one dominant downtown surrounded by car-dependent sprawl. That's why walkable space in DC commands a massive premium over drivable suburban areas. The height restrictions that were designed to preserve symbolic views created an urban form that people are willing to pay significantly more to access. The horizontal density demonstrates that you can create vibrant urban environments and strong real estate markets without vertical towers. The urban form people prefer is the mid-rise density of Paris or Barcelona, where buildings stay at human scale and streets remain open to the sun. The Washington, D.C. metropolitan region is widely considered as one of the most walkable urban areas in the United States, and that walkability generates measurable economic value. L'Enfant designed a city to glorify democratic institutions. Congress passed a law to protect symbolic sightlines. The Macmillan Commission restored grand ceremonial spaces. None of them intended to create one of the most walkable cities in America. But that's exactly what happened. However, the trade-offs are real. The height limits have been estimated to cost the city up to around $115 million in lost tax revenue. Housing costs have risen faster than almost any other American city over the past few decades, partly because you can't build dense housing downtown. The rent premium that makes walkable space valuable also makes it expensive. But those costs bought something that can't be rebuilt once it's lost. A skyline where you can still see the Capitol Dome from across the city. A downtown where sunlight reaches the sidewalks. A 200-year-old plan that still governs how the city reveals itself as pedestrians move through it. Chicago achieved perfection through pure logic. The city's flat terrain allowed surveyors to draw perpendicular lines optimized for efficient development. Washington, D.C. achieved excellence through a completely different path, using European palace planning principles to create a city that celebrates democratic government rather than commercial efficiency. Neither approach is superior. They represent different philosophies about what cities should prioritize and what urban design can accomplish. The height restrictions that lock Washington's skyline in place have remained for over a century, and will likely continue indefinitely. They're protected by federal law, supported by residents who value the city's unique character, and reinforced by the precedent set when the Macmillan Commission restored L'Enfant's vision after it nearly disappeared. Washington, D.C. is the counterpoint to Chicago's industrial perfection, a city built for grandeur rather than efficiency, where symbolic meaning takes precedence over market logic. The result is a capital that looks and functions like no other major metro area in America, built according to principles that have survived 2 centuries intact. The genius isn't just in the original design, it's in the legal and institutional frameworks that protected that design long enough for it to become irreplaceable.